My name is Livia Lambert, and I am 28 years old. Last Tuesday, while I was standing on a dry, windswept runway in Scranton, coordinating a medical evacuation unit for a C-130 transport, my life shifted into high-definition clarity. My phone wouldn't stop vibrating in my cargo pocket. 17 missed calls. It was my father, Elias. His message flashed across the screen. I need $8,000 for Emily's wedding. Don't make me ask again. You're a soldier. Start acting like you have some honor and pay what you owe this family. No. Are you safe? No. Good luck on the mission. To him, I wasn't a captain. I was just a mobile ATM that had finally matured. He thought he still had rank over me. He thought he could weaponize family honor to bleed me dry one more time. But he forgot the first rule of engagement. Never underestimate an officer who has already seen too much death to be moved by fake tears. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I opened my banking app, typed in 8,000, and then slowly, deliberately deleted 3 zeros. $8 sent. Good luck, I replied. I hit power off just as his first frantic call tried to break through, and I turned my back on the noise. Captain, my sergeant asked, everything okay? I tightened my tactical boots and looked toward the horizon. Radio silence is in effect. We're wheels up. If this story touches you, please like and subscribe to follow Livia's journey, and leave your local time in the comments. Now join me as we start the story. The wind at the Scranton airport didn't just blow, it bit. It carried the sharp, metallic tang of an old steel town, a place that used to make things before it started breaking people. I stood on the runway, my back straight against the freezing gusts that tried to knock the clipboard out of my hand. High above, the gray belly of a C-130. Oh, Hercules loomed, its 4 massive engines churning the air into a thick soup of diesel fumes and noise. I was a medical officer, a captain who hadn't slept in more hours than I cared to count, and my job was to get the wounded home. I moved with the kind of economy the Army beats into you. No wasted energy, no unnecessary words. My hands were stained with grease, and the red cross patch on my shoulder was dark with the dust of a long road. A young private, his face still holding a ghost of baby fat, passed me with a litter. He stopped and greeted me with a sharp, mechanical hand-to-brow motion that I returned out of pure reflex. In this world of steel and medicine, everything made sense. Orders were followed. Logic was king. Then the phone in my uniform pocket started its frantic dance. It rattled against my hip 17 separate times. Each vibration was a reminder of a life I had tried to leave behind. A world where the only thing that mattered was how much I could be bled for. I stepped away from the deafening whine of the propellers and pulled the device out. The screen was a wall of missed calls from a contact saved simply as Dad. Elias Lambert, a man who had spent 30 years in a steel mill and the rest of his life using family honor as a leash to pull me toward his own selfishness. A text message popped up on the lock screen, glowing like a neon warning sign. I need $8,000 for Emily's wedding. Don't make me repeat myself. There was no question about where I was, no concern about whether I was still breathing after my last deployment. To him, I wasn't a soldier or a daughter. I was a line of credit that happened to wear a uniform. I stood there for a long moment, the noise of the airfield fading into a dull roar in the back of my mind. I didn't feel the heat of a temper or the sting of tears. The Army had taught me that emotion is just noise that clutters a clear signal. I opened the banking app, my fingers moving with the same precision I used to check a patient's vitals. I typed the number 8, then 3 zeros. Then, slowly, I hit the backspace. 1 0, gone. 2. 3. $8 sent. Good luck, I typed. I hit send. It wasn't a victory. It was the feeling of someone finally reaching out and pulling the plug on a polluted source. The phone immediately lit up again, a desperate, angry buzz that I ignored. I shoved the phone deep into my pocket and knelt to pull my bootlaces tight, feeling the leather bite into my skin. Around me, the unit kept moving, men and equipment being swallowed by the cavernous mouth of the aircraft. A sergeant stopped next to me, his breath coming in white puffs in the cold Scranton air. "Everything okay, Captain?" he asked. I stood up, adjusted the brim of my cap, and looked out over the gray horizon where the runway met the sky. "Everything is fine, Sergeant," I said, my voice as flat and hard as the concrete under my feet. "We're leaving. Start the engines." As I turned toward the ramp, the wind shifted, bringing with it a thick, bitter smell of gray smoke from the jet engines. It was a smell that didn't belong to the present. It was a smell that pulled me back 3 years, to a different runway and a different kind of silence, one where a row of empty chairs had told me exactly what I was worth to the people I shared a name with. That was the day it died. 3 years ago, the sun at Fort Moore wasn't a source of warmth, it was a blade. It cut through the humidity and beat down on the parade ground like a spotlight meant to expose every single crack in the aging wooden bleachers. I stood in formation, spine a steel rod, eyes locked onto a specific coordinate in the front row, third seat from the left. That was the spot. I confirmed it with Elias twice. I sent the map, the directions, and the plane ticket money. Around me, the air was a sea of laughing families, cheap perfume, and dust kicked up by thousands of boots. But at my coordinate, there was nothing but the heavy, mocking silence of empty wood and iron. The loudspeakers rattled with the booming voices of colonels talking about honor and the heavy burden of leadership. I listened to the rhythmic thud of feet on the ground, but my ears were tuned to something else. I heard Miller's mother behind me, sobbing with a pride so loud it felt like it was bruising my skin when her son's name was called. I heard the roar of the crowd, a collective heartbeat that belonged to everyone but me. Every round of applause felt like a hammer hitting a nail into my own isolation. I sent letters. I sent money. Elias had just sighed weeks before. Yeah, we'll see about that. And now, standing under that unforgiving sun, I realized that "we'll see" was just a blue-collar way of saying, "You aren't worth the trip." When the ceremony finally ended and the order was given to dismiss, the families flooded the field like a tidal wave, drowning the grass in hugs and tears. I stood perfectly still, an abandoned boundary marker in the middle of a celebration that didn't have a place for me. I watched other fathers clap their daughters on the shoulder. I watched sisters scream with joy. I was a ghost in a sharp uniform. Miller's mother approached, seeing the stone-cold emptiness in my eyes. She asked softly if there was no one there for me. I shook my head and whispered, "No, ma'am." The stranger pulled me into a hug that smelled like lavender and laundry soap. It was a hug so honest that it nearly shattered the armor I had spent my entire life building. "I am proud of you," she said. Those 5 words were worth more than every sentence Elias Lambert had uttered to me in 25 years. Later that night, I went back to the parade ground. I sat alone on the steps of the bleachers, where the wood still held the day's heat. The crowd was long gone, leaving behind nothing but discarded programs and the hum of the cicadas. I pulled out my phone and called home, one last time, looking for some kind of logic. Elias picked up on the 3rd ring, and immediately, the loud, mindless drone of a game show blared through the speaker. "What are you calling for now?" he snapped. "Emily's wedding is only 6 months away, and we are buried in guest lists. I don't have time for your little formal ceremonies." I stayed silent, the coldness in my chest turning into a solid block of ice. Elias didn't stop there. He let out a dry, condescending laugh. "You always have something to prove, Livia," he said, his voice dripping with a casual kind of cruelty. "Going into the army was just another way for you to put on a show and act better than us." I didn't argue. I didn't explain the sleepless nights or the weight of the responsibility. I just hung up the phone. I realized I had been exiled from my own family. To them, I was just a girl in a costume they refused to recognize. I stood up, smoothed my uniform, and walked away, finally understanding that the only person ever going to show up for me was me. The March rain in Scranton didn't fall so much as it attacked. A cold, relentless drizzle that carried the bitter scent of wet soot and abandoned coal mines. It was the kind of weather that seeped through the seams of a field jacket and settled into the marrow of your bones. I pulled my collar up as I stepped onto the porch of the house I had spent 5 years paying for, a house I had barely lived in. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't want the warmth or the comfort. I wanted the cold. I sat on the edge of the stiff sofa in the living room, the only illumination coming from the pale, flickering blue glow of my laptop. My fingers felt like lead as I typed, navigating through the secure portals of my military bank accounts and retirement funds. I wasn't looking for a paycheck. I was conducting a damage assessment. The screen refreshed, and the numbers that stared back at me felt like a physical strike to the ribs. My retirement savings, the money I had set aside while eating dust in a dozen different tents, was a shell. Someone had opened a massive line of credit in my name and drained every cent of it. I dug deeper, my eyes scanning the transaction history with the detached precision of a medic triaging a mass casualty event. There were dozens of charges on my emergency card, a card that was supposed to stay in a safe for life or death situations. Every single one was for something frivolous. Thousands of dollars spent at high-end bridal boutiques, deposits for luxury catering, and down payments for a ballroom I would never step foot in. It wasn't an error. It was a total breach of security. I didn't cry. I didn't even curse. I just sat there in the dark, my heart rate slowing into the steady, rhythmic thrum of a long-range shooter, waiting for the wind to settle. I processed the data. The $8,000 Elias had demanded on the runway was just the smoke from a much larger fire. He hadn't just asked for a handout. He had systematically dismantled my future while I was away. He used my name, my signature, and the weight of the word family to turn me into a debtor in my own home. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a compromised system. The person who was supposed to be my primary line of defense had become the most dangerous threat to the mission. The silence of the house was shattered by 3 sharp, heavy thuds against the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was a demand for entry. The door swung open before I could even stand. Elias Lambert walked into the room, the smell of cheap cigarettes and wet wool following him like a shadow. He didn't say hello. He didn't ask how the deployment was. He just stood in the center of the living room, his eyes darting around like a man looking for something to sell. He looked at the leather chairs and the large television on the wall, his mouth curling into a thin, judgmental line. "This place looks pretty good," he muttered, his voice thick with the arrogance of a man who believed everything I owned was rightfully his. He walked over to the kitchen counter and dragged a rough finger through the dust, looking at me like I was a servant who had failed to keep up the estate. I stayed in the shadows, watching him. I evaluated his posture, his tone, the way he occupied my space without a hint of shame. He started talking, his voice rising as he explained why Emily needed a wedding that would make the neighbors jealous. He talked about family duty and how an officer's salary meant I had a responsibility to provide for the ones who stayed behind. He said Emily couldn't be embarrassed in front of her new in-laws. He spoke as if my life's work was a communal pot, and he was the only one allowed to hold the spoon. "I'm not asking for much, Livia," he said, turning toward me with a smug look. "You've got plenty. You don't even have kids. What else are you going to do with it? Buy more gear. You owe us for everything we did to get you where you are." I didn't interrupt. I didn't defend myself. I just sat there, my eyes locked on him, measuring the distance. Elias took my silence for the same quiet surrender he had seen 10 years ago. He thought he had won. He thought he had broken me down until I was nothing more than an ATM with a rank. He didn't realize that in my world, silence isn't a sign of weakness. It is the first step of the procedure. It is the moment you stop talking so you can focus on the weight of the trigger. I was no longer a daughter listening to a father. I was a shooter, and I was just starting to put the round into the chamber. The morning fog in Scranton didn't lift. It just hung there like a damp, gray wool blanket over the coal-dusted streets. By 2 in the afternoon on May 7th, the air inside my living room felt even heavier than the mist outside. Elias hadn't just come back. He brought the storm with him. This time, he wasn't alone. Emily stood beside him, her eyes red and puffy in a way that looked practiced. A damp tissue clutched in her hand like a white flag of surrender she had no intention of actually using. They moved into my space without an invitation, colonizing my living room with the smell of cheap convenience store coffee and the suffocating weight of their shared entitlement. The attack started before they even sat down. Elias didn't look at me. He looked through me, his voice a gravelly roar that seemed to vibrate the floorboards. He began a lecture on family morality, using the very career I had bled for as a weapon against me. He shouted about how I was supposedly protecting the country while letting my own flesh and blood rot in the gutter. He used the word daughter as if it were a synonym for debtor. Beside him, Emily let out a shaky breath, whispering about how I had become cold-blooded and ungrateful since I started wearing the bars on my shoulders. She looked at my neat, orderly home with a sneer disguised as a sob, claiming that my military life had stripped away my heart. I sat in my armchair, watching the way their mouths moved, reading the signals of their alliance. I didn't say a word. I didn't defend my honor. I just recorded every twitch of their faces in my mind, treating their presence like a breach in a secure perimeter that needed to be mapped. Then, Elias crossed a line he couldn't come back from. He stood up and walked toward the corner of the room where my dress uniform hung on a display rack. It was the only thing in the house that looked perfect, crisp, dark, and heavy with history. I felt my chest tighten as his rough, nicotine-stained fingers brushed against the fabric. He didn't see the nights of study, the miles of mud, or the lives I had saved. He only saw leverage. With a sudden, violent jerk, he ripped a silver commendation medal from its ribbon. He held it up for a second, then tossed it into the far corner of the room. It hit the hardwood with a tiny, sharp clink and rolled under a dusty radiator like a piece of garbage. He told me that this scrap metal wouldn't feed the family or pay for a wedding cake. He told me that my pride was a luxury he was no longer willing to tolerate. Under the table, I sipped air through my nose, my knuckles turning white as I clenched my fists until the skin felt like it was going to split. My face remained a mask of iron. I felt the heat rising in my throat, the urge to show him exactly what a combat medic could do to a threat, but I pushed it down into a cold, dark place. I realized he was trying to bait me into an outburst, a mistake he could use to justify more of his greed. I chose to stay in the shadows of my own mind. I was a professional observer now, and he was nothing more than a failing system I was preparing to shut down. Slowly, I stood up. I walked across the room, knelt on the cold floor, and picked up the silver medal. I wiped the dust from it with my thumb, the metal cool against my skin, and tucked it safely into my pocket. I turned to Elias and gave him a short, shallow nod. I told him I had heard him, and that I would reconsider the expenses for the wedding. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face, the look of a man who thought he had finally snapped the spring. He started babbling about furniture and guest lists, thinking I had finally crumbled under the weight of his authority. He had no idea that he was handing me every piece of financial evidence I needed. When they finally left, laughing about their victory, I didn't let out a single tear. I walked to my desk, opened a secret drawer, and pulled out a hardbound black notebook. With the cold, flat precision of a field report, I wrote, May 7th, 2 in the afternoon. Subject compromised military property. Manipulative language recorded. Ungrateful responsibility. System failure confirmed. I closed the book with a sharp, dry snap. Elias thought he was winning because I was quiet. He didn't know that in a siege, the loudest person is usually the first to fall. I was just beginning to measure the distance. The fog over Scranton was a thick, wet wall that swallowed the streetlights and turned the morning into a blurry gray nightmare. I didn't go back to the house after my shift ended. I couldn't breathe in a place that had been turned into a hunting ground for my own father's greed. Instead, I drove back to the office, the heater in my old car humming a lonely, rattling tune against the biting cold outside. The air inside the building smelled like stale coffee and the heavy dust of 1,000 ignored files. I sat at a cold steel desk, my fingers tapping a steady, rhythmic beat on the metal surface while I waited for the line to connect. I wasn't making a friendly call or looking for someone to tell me everything would be fine. I was reaching out to a military lawyer I had known for years, the kind of man who didn't care about feelings, only the hard, undeniable truth of the law. I needed a professional to look into the darkness Elias had created. I asked for a complete investigation into every single account that had my name on it. I told him to look for every signature, every bank loan, and every single penny that had moved without my eyes seeing it first. This wasn't just about the $8,000 anymore. This was about figuring out how deep the rot had gone inside the only family I had ever known. I needed to see the full map of the wreckage before I could start the cleanup. The lawyer's voice was dry, like sandpaper on old wood, as he asked the questions that made my skin crawl with a mix of shame and anger. I had to sit there in that cold room and admit, out loud, that my father had forged my name to pay for a wedding I wasn't even invited to. I bit my lip so hard I could taste the metallic tang of blood, the sharp sting of it grounding me in the reality of my own humiliation. He asked me if I was really sure about doing this, reminding me with a quiet voice that it would destroy whatever was left of my father's name in this town. I looked at a photo on my wall of the people I had served with, the only real family I had ever found, and my voice came out as cold and flat as a winter morning in the mountains. I told him that Elias had destroyed his own name 3 years ago, when he decided a row of empty chairs was all I deserved for my work. I wasn't the one breaking the bond. I was just the one finally acknowledging that it had already been shattered. 3 hours later, a digital file arrived on my screen, marked with a heavy red warning that it was restricted and intended only for me. I opened the documents, and the numbers began to tell a story that was even uglier than anything I had imagined in the dark. Elias hadn't just taken a few $1,000s for a party. He had gone after my retirement, the safety net I had spent my youth building, while he sat on his porch and complained about how unfair the world was. He had gambled with my future to buy a moment of fake glory for Emily. I felt every page like a fresh cut, but my heart didn't speed up. It stayed steady, sinking into a deep, quiet place where only logic remained. I printed the whole pile, the machine spitting out the pages with a rhythmic sound that filled the silent, empty room. I touched the paper, feeling the rough texture and the sharp, chemical scent of fresh ink. I finally had the weapon I needed to end this cycle. I placed the stack into a plastic binder and closed it with a sharp, dry snap that echoed against the office walls. I didn't feel like celebrating or laughing. There was no joy in seeing the man who raised me turn into a common thief. But as I looked at the binder, a plan finally formed. The light in my kitchen was a harsh, flickering yellow that made the shadows in the corners look deeper than they really were. I sat at the scratched wooden table, watching Elias pace the floor like a man who had finally inherited a kingdom he didn't build. He was holding a stack of glossy pamphlets for a catering hall in downtown Scranton, pointing at pictures of crystal chandeliers and overpriced prime rib. He told me that $8,000 wasn't going to be enough anymore. He said the wedding had to be a statement, a way to show everyone that the Lambert family was finally back on top. He demanded an extra $5,000 for a custom flower wall and an open bar that would flow until 3 in the morning. I didn't fight him. I didn't point out that he had already stolen twice that amount from my savings while I was away. I just looked him in the eye and gave him a slow, heavy nod. "I hear you," I said softly. Elias stopped pacing and looked at me, a flash of surprise crossing his face before it was replaced by a smug, greasy grin. He probably thought the fight had finally drained out of me. He thought the weight of his fatherly authority had finally crushed my spine. He laughed, a dry, rattling sound that made my skin crawl, and reached out to pat me on the shoulder with a hand that felt like lead. He told me he knew I would eventually come to my senses and remember who took care of me when I was a kid. He told me that being a big officer didn't mean I could forget where I came from. I didn't pull away. I just sat there, cold and still, letting him believe that his lies had finally won. The phone calls started almost immediately. From the other room, I could hear him bragging to our relatives, his voice booming with a fake pride that made me want to get sick. He told Aunt Sarah that I had finally learned my place. He told his friends at the bar that he had handled his stubborn daughter and that the money was flowing again. He walked around the house like a landlord, checking the thermostat and complaining about the bread in the pantry. He thought he had successfully broken the spirit of a woman who had seen things in places where people died that would have made him faint. I watched him from the doorway, keeping my face as blank as a sheet of paper. Every time he spoke, every time he insulted my life's work with his arrogant laughter, I just added another line to the mental map I was building. He was digging a hole so deep he wouldn't even see the sky when he reached the bottom. By 11 at night, the house was finally quiet. I went into my small home office and locked the door. The only light came from a small desk lamp that cast a sharp circle of white onto the blotter. I reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out my personal handgun, a heavy piece of dark steel that felt familiar and honest in my grip. I began to take it apart, piece by piece, my fingers moving with a speed that came from years of repetition. I cleaned each part with a cloth dampened by the sharp, stinging scent of cleaning fluid. The mechanical sound of the metal clicking against the desk was the only thing that kept me grounded. Dealing with a person like Elias was different than a fight in the mud. Out there, you knew who the enemy was because they were the ones holding the guns. In here, the enemy held a beer and a family tree. Mark walked in toward midnight, carrying a mug of black coffee that was so hot the steam blurred his glasses. He didn't say a word. He just sat on the edge of the desk and watched me reassemble the weapon. I looked up at him, my eyes hard and dry. I told him that Elias thought I had given up. I told him that my father was currently dancing on a floor made of thin glass. And he didn't even realize how heavy he was. Mark just nodded, his silence a shield that protected me from the noise of the rest of my family. He knew I was just waiting for the right moment to step back and let the whole structure collapse. My phone vibrated. It was Emily, demanding another $3,000 for a photographer. She added a heart emoji. I didn't reply. I just slid the final piece of dark steel into its proper place. The sharp, metallic click echoed through the silent, cold room like a final period at the very, very end. The trap was finally set. The stage lights in the Scranton banquet hall were so bright they felt like a physical weight against my skin. Elias stood at the center of the platform, the microphone gripped in his hand like a scepter. He looked out at the 300 people in the room, his friends from the mill, the cousins he hadn't spoken to in years, and the neighbors he spent every day trying to impress. He was a man at the peak of his own lie. He reached into his tuxedo pocket and pulled out a thick legal document, his face flushed with the kind of smugness that only comes from thinking you finally won. He waved me over, his voice booming through the speakers, dripping with a fake, fatherly warmth that made my stomach turn. He told the crowd that I was about to sign a document that would secure the future of the Lambert family, a formal agreement to handle the estate and the wedding expenses. He was using the silence of the room as a cage, believing that my pride and the formal blue clothing I wore would keep me from making a scene. He slid a silver pen across the podium toward me, his eyes burning with a silent command. "Sign it, Livia," he whispered, the sound caught by the microphone and echoing like a threat. "Do it for your sister. Do it for the name you carry." I stood perfectly still, my back straight and my hands at my sides. I didn't look at the paper. I didn't look at the pen. I just watched him. I watched the way his hand shook ever so slightly, the way the sweat was beginning to ruin the collar of his expensive shirt. I waited for him to cross the line. When I didn't move, he began to lecture me, his voice rising, calling me stubborn and cold in front of everyone we knew. He was trying to shame me into submission. I just gave a slow, shallow nod to the man in the gray suit standing near the back of the hall. The silence of the room was suddenly broken by the sound of hard-soled shoes hitting the wooden stage. The man in the gray suit walked up the stairs, his face a mask of professional calm. He didn't look at the guests. He only looked at Elias. He introduced himself as my legal representative and handed my father a bright red folder. The smug, greasy smile on Elias's face didn't just fade, it vanished, replaced by a pale, hollow look of pure terror. A larger power, one built on facts and cold numbers, had finally entered the room to protect my assets. The people in the front rows, the ones who had been nodding along with Elias's lies, suddenly began to lean back, their eyes darting away as they realized the situation had changed. The lawyer didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He opened the folder and began to read from the audit records under the harsh white lights of the stage. He spoke about the $34,000 Elias had moved out of my retirement fund by faking my signature while I was working on the other side of the world. He read the exact dates and the exact locations where my emergency credit card had been used to pay for luxury catering and a $5,000 designer dress for Emily. Each word was like a sharp, clean cut. He spoke about the loan Elias had tried to take out against my house, a property he didn't own a single brick of. The hall was so quiet you could hear the rustle of the paper as the lawyer turned the pages. Elias tried to speak, his voice cracking like dry wood, babbling about family duty and how he was just trying to manage things. But nobody was listening to his stories anymore. The gray-suited man just kept reading, laying out the evidence of a year of theft and betrayal for the whole town to hear. I didn't say a word. I didn't have to. I stood like a statue of iron, watching the man who raised me crumble into a pile of excuses and shaky breaths. I didn't feel happy, and I didn't feel sad. I just felt a deep, quiet clarity. When the reading was finished, the lawyer closed the folder with a sharp, final snap. The power had shifted so completely that Elias looked small, like a child caught in a lie he couldn't explain away. I stepped toward him, my boots hitting the floor with a steady, haunting rhythm. I leaned in close, catching the scent of the cheap scotch on his breath one last time. "The play's over, Elias," I said, my voice barely a whisper, but hard as a stone. "Welcome to reality." I turned my back on him and walked down the stage, through the stunned silence of the room, and out of the doors. I left the wreckage of his ego behind me, and for the first time in my life, the air outside felt clean. The night wind in Scranton didn't just howl. It whistled through the thin gaps in the heavy double doors of the hall like a judge's gavel hitting a desk. The party was over. The 300 guests who had just witnessed the public execution of a man's dignity were long gone, leaving behind nothing but the heavy smell of burnt-out wax and spilled wine. I didn't rush to leave. I stood at the center of the room, my fingers moving with a steady, quiet rhythm as I rebuttoned my jacket. I tucked the binder full of the stolen bank records back into my leather briefcase. The sharp click of the metal latch was the only sound in the cavernous space. Elias was still there, leaning against the edge of a table covered in stained white linen. He looked smaller than he had an hour ago. His broad shoulders slumped, and his face the color of the gray ash that used to pour out of the old steel mills across the river. He wasn't yelling anymore. He just sat there in the shadows of the empty chairs, his silence smelling of cold alcohol and heavy defeat. I walked toward the exit, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a sound that felt as final as a heartbeat. I didn't want to look at him, but he forced me to. He lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot and watery, still trying to find a spark of that old anger he used to control the room. He let out a dry, rasping cough. "Are you happy now?" he asked, his voice shaking with a desperate kind of bitterness. "You didn't just take the money. You destroyed this whole family in front of everyone we know. You turned your own blood into a joke for the whole town to laugh at." He was still trying to do it. Even now, with his world in pieces on the floor, he was trying to use the word family like a weapon to make me feel small. He was playing the victim, the poor father who had been stabbed in the back by his cold, ungrateful daughter on the night of her sister's celebration. I stopped. I didn't turn around immediately. I stood there for a second, feeling the cold air from the doorway on the back of my neck. Then I slowly faced him. I didn't feel the heat of anger or the sting of a betrayal. I just felt a deep, clinical curiosity. I looked at him the way a doctor looks at a broken bone that has healed crookedly. I didn't use a single loud word. I kept my voice low and level, letting the truth do the cutting for me. "I didn't shame you, Elias," I said. "The people in that room didn't laugh because of what I said. They laughed because they finally saw what you really are. I didn't ruin this family. I just took away the mask you've been wearing for 30 years, and you're terrified because you don't like what's underneath it." I took a step closer, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted him to see the clarity in my eyes. I wanted him to understand that the old tricks were dead. "You never cared about Emily's wedding or this family's name," I told him, each word a sharp, clean strike. "You only cared about having a hand on my neck so you could feel powerful while you bled me dry. You used Emily as an excuse to feed your own weak ego because you were too small to build anything of your own." He flinched as if I had struck him, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He tried to speak, tried to find one more lie to tell, but the air had finally run out of his lungs. He was trembling now, his hands clutching the edge of the table so hard the wood groaned. The fire was gone. He looked at me, and for the first time in my 28 years, I saw him truly afraid of me. "So what now?" he asked, his voice a pathetic whisper. "Are you going to sue me? Are you going to put me in a cage until I die? Is that the revenge you wanted?" I picked up my briefcase, the weight of it feeling lighter than it ever had before. I looked at the exit, then back at him one last time. "I don't want your money, and I don't want your apologies," I said. Revenge is for people who still care. The greatest punishment I can give you is my permanent absence. From this moment on, I am gone. You are officially on your own. I turned my back on the shadow of the man he used to be and walked out into the cold Scranton night, leaving him alone in the dark. The dawn over Scranton wasn't an event. It was just a slow, gray thinning of the darkness that had clung to the hills all night. I drove my car up the steep driveway, the tires crunching over the gravel in the only sound in the neighborhood. The house sat there, solid and still, waiting for me like a loyal friend. I stepped inside and didn't turn on a single lamp. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a threat. It didn't feel like the heavy, suffocating quiet of someone waiting to jump out of the shadows and demand a piece of my life. It was just a house. My house. There were no voices echoing from the past, no lingering residue of Emily's constant, high-pitched needs. It was finally empty of everyone but me. I walked into my bedroom and stood in front of the mirror, but I didn't look at my face. I looked at the dark blue jacket I had worn with so much pride. My fingers moved slowly, unhooking each silver button and removing the metals that had once felt so heavy. Each piece of metal I took off felt like I was disarming a complicated machine. I hung the uniform on its wooden stand, smoothing out the fabric. It was the only thing I had ever done right in their eyes, and now it was just clothing. I walked into the bathroom and turned the shower on as hot as I could stand it. The steam filled the room, thick and white. I stood under the spray for a long time, washing away the smell of the banquet hall. The kitchen was cold when I walked in, the granite countertops feeling like ice under my palms. My phone vibrated on the table, a sharp buzz that broke the peace. I didn't have to look to know who it was. I sat down and pulled up the email from Emily. It was long, filled with words about how blood is thicker than water and how Dad was getting old. She told me I should be the bigger person and find a way to forgive him for the family. It was a tired attempt to pull me back into the swamp. I read it, but I didn't feel anger. I just felt bored. I set the phone face down on the counter and didn't type a single word in response. I sat by the window, watching the sun finally climb over the skyline of Scranton. I looked down at the old white scar on my wrist, a reminder of a time when I thought my worth was measured by how much I could bleed for people who didn't love me. I knew then that walking away wasn't a clean victory. It isn't a movie ending without a scratch. It is a loss. I had lost the idea of a father and a sister, and that was a price to pay. I looked at it like a bill that had finally come due. It was the cost of my own life, and I was happy to pay it. I got up and started the coffee maker, the sound of the water dripping filling the kitchen. The smell of the dark roast was strong and honest. I poured a mug and sat back down, watching the world wake up. I didn't care what version of the story they were telling the rest of the town. I didn't care if they called me a villain. My responsibility to them ended exactly where my own life began. I took a sip of the hot coffee and closed my eyes, feeling the warmth. Tonight, for the first time in 10 years, I was going to sleep for 10 hours straight. The war was over, and I was the only one left standing on my own ground. The morning air was crisp, and the steam from the cup clouded my vision for a brief moment, soft and white like a winter cloud. I breathed it in, tasting the sharp bitterness of the black beans. I had no more orders to follow, and no more old ghosts to fight in the dark tonight.